sounds like a story to me, some crazy fable that you would not believe. Oh, but ain't you...
Welcome to the Avram Davidson universe, where we listen to some of the greatest stories ever written, adored by Ursula Le Guin, Neil Gaiman, Leonard Nimoy, Ray Bradbury, and Stephen King. Enjoy classic tales such as Are All the Seas with Oysters, The Golem, Sources of the Nile, and many others. Hey everybody, welcome to this episode of the Avram Davidson universe. Today we are going to be listening to the very first chapter of Beer, 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 which we just had published, and this was a never before published Avram novel. It's one of my favorites, and I'm really excited for today's guest. Her name is Nancy Klein, and her husband is Sidney Klein, and they're dear friends of Avram when he was much younger. So I'm hoping we'll get a sense of Avram, a young Avram Davidson, and hear some of those memories. She also wrote recently a book called A Joy of Life, the Sidney Klein story. So I'm looking forward to hearing about that as well. Nancy, thank you so much for joining.
My pleasure.
So to me, how we met is a fascinating story, I think, in and of itself. I'll describe it really fast. So, as you know, I was working on an unpublished Avram book called Beer, Beer, Beer. And I really wanted to get a sense from folks in Yonkers, where I think the book takes place, what they thought. Did it feel authentic? And so I posted I made a post on a Yonkers historical page on Facebook, looking for advanced copy reviewers. And I received a message back from somebody with the last name Klein saying, hey, I think I know someone who'd really like to read the story. I said, sure, not really thinking anything about it. And then next thing you know, he introduces me to you, and I learn about the connection that basically you were married to Sidney Klein, and that you were both dear friends of Avram's. And to the point, immediately I recognized, oh my gosh, Sidney Klein wrote a story with Avram. And anyways, all these connections, I thought it was fantastic. So I'd love to just hear a little bit about kind of your background and how you and Sidney met Avram, or knew him, or just kind of that history.
Well, I, like Avram, was born and brought up in Yonkers, and my husband had a lot of family here, but he didn't come till 1946. But his older brother was a friend of Avram's, who at that time was known as Dolph. His name was Adolf, but nobody wanted to be called Adolf. And
let me jump in there real quick. So I've never talked about that. It's actually in some way, which is great. I mean, I think you're in some ways a dear old friend. I think it's a perfect person to bring that up. I knew about this, but I think he was very quiet about it. As you know, he went by AA for a time, right. And it doesn't sound like there was any emotional turmoil behind it. It was just simply, I'm not going to go by the name of Adolf as a Jew in the 1940s or 50s. I mean, do you want to talk about that a little bit?
Well, we always thought it was just a little odd. I mean, there were older people named Adolf, pre-Hitler, but when he started using A.A. Davidson, we kind of heaved a sigh of relief. This sounded better to us. And so we had no problem calling him Avram.
Do you any idea why he chose Avram in particular, or not really? Just
that's probably his Hebrew name.
Okay, gotcha. Okay, so sorry, go ahead. So go on about how you guys met Avram.
Yeah, so the young Jewish people, we had some clubs. I don't remember exactly. The guys would get together, and he was just part of the group that we hung out with, even though he was older than we were. I mean, older than I was. I was younger, but I mean, I don't remember when I first met him. It was a long time ago. And I remember his mother, who was a very sweet little lady. And I also at some point met his sister, but they were estranged and they never talked that I can recall.
I didn't know that.
Yeah, she had a big position with Consumers Union, Consumer Reports in Yonkers. They're headquartered in Yonkers, but they had a falling out early on, and they did not talk for many, many years.
Huh.
So
Okay.
I kind of lost track of her.
Huh. Any particular memories of Avram that jump out at you?
Oh, at all, or from early days?
Early days, just early days, or even at all.
Yeah, yeah. Well, I recall, I guess, we used to do things in the synagogue together. And then after we were married, well, he just hit it off with Sid. And so they both had crazy senses of humor. So wherever he was in England, he was in Israel, we always kept up a crazy correspondence. And when he was back in Yonkers in the 50s, he was at our house every Saturday afternoon. He was like part of the family, and the kids, he loved the kids and they loved him. And we just had a very good time together.
Yeah, it's a constant theme, I think, with Avram is he treated children, I think, so wonderfully. I mean, including me as a child. And I've talked to others who just said he was just, he could be feisty or difficult when it came to adults. But when
children, yeah.
But when it came to children, he was just so kind. Any thoughts there?
Yeah, well, at that point, I think it was before my daughter was born. So I had 3 boys who would have been, 4, 5, 6 years old. And he just fit into the family. We all had a good time.
Now, I know you met my mom, I guess.
Yes. Mm-hmm.
So, and I understand you were at their wedding.
We were at the wedding. Oh, yes.
And I'm trying to imagine, I mean, there must have been so many thoughts. Number one, my mom was a lot younger than Avram. I don't know if that was something that was talked about. Obviously,
we were just happy he found somebody.
Okay. And then he was also Orthodox, and I mean, I guess she gravitated towards that. But what was that wedding like?
Whoa. The wedding was held in a farmhouse belonging to one of his science fiction writer friends. I can't recall his name at the moment. It was in Pennsylvania, and it was a big old drafty farmhouse. And we were all freezing, and the owner's 2-year-old was running around in nothing but a diaper, which we found really interesting. And there were some friends from Yonkers and his mother and some of his science fiction friends. I don't think Grania had too much family there, but it was a small group. Actually, we escorted her down the aisle.
Oh my gosh.
Interestingly, she was wearing a black dress. And I thought, oh, what a calm bride. It's almost time for the wedding and she didn't change yet, but that was her dress.
Oh my gosh.
And he had an Orthodox rabbi perform the ceremony. And then recall we had some refreshments, and actually we drove his mother back to Yonkers.
Oh my gosh. Wow.
Yeah.
And do you recall her reaction to all of this?
I think she was happy that her boy was finally getting married. She was happy. Yeah.
Okay. Talk to me a little bit about the story. So the Teeth of Despair. was a story that Avram and Sidney wrote together. A lot of people may not know it. I always describe it as a spin-off to Help I'm Dr. Morris Goldpepper, because it actually uses one of Dr. Morris Goldpepper's devices. So I'd love to know about how that came about. Yeah.
As best I recall, it came about probably from sitting around on Saturday afternoon talking, and Sid got this idea and pitched it to Avram, and he said, "Let's do this." And there they were.
Oh my gosh. What about you? I know you wrote a book, which I ordered and I've started, and I'm really looking forward to finishing a Life of Joy, the Sidney Klein story. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Well, Sid was an unusual person. He at 17, towards the end of World War II, he enlisted in the Marine Corps, and there were not too many Orthodox Jews in the Marine Corps. But he managed to put a funny spin on everything. And in the book, I have a lot of things that he wrote. Of course, the Marine Corps was a very difficult adventure. But he told the children all these funny stories, and one of my grandsons said, "How come my father didn't join the Marines?" And I said, "Why on earth would he want to do that?" And he said, "Because Papa had such a good time in the Marine Corps." But he had gone to high school taking a machinist course. And then he went directly into the Marines. And when he got out of the Marines, his family had moved to Yonkers. That's when I met him. And my father decided that if this was going to be serious, this boy really needed to go to college. And my father was dean of Yeshiva College at that time. So he constructed a special course for returning veterans. And so that's how he got his college degree and went on to get a master's in math and education. And putting that all together, he became a mechanical engineer. And he enjoyed life. He always had a good time and a lot of humor, which thank goodness is passed down to his children.
You mentioned the Marines and being Orthodox. I know Avram, obviously, at that time was Orthodox. He wasn't initially. Right. He was also in the Marines as a corpsman.
Yeah.
Or in the Navy.
He was really technically in the Navy, but they served the Marines.
Right. Yeah. They served the Marines as a corpsman. So any thoughts there? And I mean, I'm just so curious about his transition from being, I don't know if he was Reform or conservative, to Orthodoxy, then to Tenrikio, and just the growth and change. Any thoughts on that in terms of your observations of Avram and those changes?
Well, I think that looking back, he was probably always very intellectually curious. Mm-hmm. And so it just, by the time I knew him, he was already pretty much Orthodox, I think. Okay. And then, as the years went by and he sort of, I don't know, got acquainted with other religions. To us, it was, okay, that's Avram. That's what he's doing.
On to the next interesting, unique.
Yeah, we still loved him anyway.
Well, I think we should take a little read or listen of the first chapter of Beer, Beer, Beer. What do you think?
Wonderful, wonderful.
Right, let's do it.
Chapter 1. One day in the early fall of a year in the early 1930s, Elmer Dugan, a boy in his early teens, his very early teens, was wandering slowly around the village, as the downtown part of Yonkers, New Jersey, was called. The streets were, for the most part, narrow and paved with stone blocks, called cobblestones by the ignorant, and the houses were all of red brick, gone dim through the decades of dust and dirt and smoke. On this street, this afternoon's walk took him along a block where the buildings were all tenement houses, mostly all, with business premises on the ground floors. Elmer had a wide mouth and a thin nose and sharp eyes. He wore a woolen jacket and linen knickers and long stockings. Not long black stockings, those, with short pants, long, short pants, formed an important part of the unofficial uniform of parochial school boys. And Elmer and his family were not Catholic. His shoes, which he frequently bent to tie, were partly laced through holes and partly, the upper part, around metal hooks. By rights, he should have been wearing a cap as well at this time of the year, a regular cloth cap with a brim, but his mother, who had ambitions, she saw him as district manager of an insurance company or something like that, wouldn't let him wear a cap. She said that only Polacks and Slovaks wore caps. "People will think you work in the sugar house," she said. Boys of his age were, some of them, already beginning to wear long pants, but although Opa had even brought over a pair which had not been called for at the tailor shop, and he said never would be, worsted, good as gold, still, Elmer's mother flatly refused to allow it. "I don't want him looking like no midget," she'd said. "Naked bussa?" asked Opa. "I said no!" So Opa shrugged and sighed and folded them under his arm and left. Also, Elmer wore a clean white shirt every day. Until not long ago, they had been starched, too, but not now. They were still ironed, though. His mother ironed them every night with a wet cloth to keep them from singeing. And oh boy, how she muttered when she did so, and gave his father such looks. When he was there, that is. Every day, a clean white ironed shirt and a necktie. But every day, even Saturday, his shoes needed shining, though. The shoes he had on had worn through before they had worn out. They always used to buy shoes from Vanderpoel and City Hall Square. The ones he had on, though, they bought from the Economy Shoe Store, right near here on Valleydale Avenue. When he showed his mother the hole, she held the shoes up and yelled, "Look at these shoes!" And his father said, "Oh, leave me alone, for Christ's sake." And she yelled, "What do you mean, leave you alone? I said, look at these shoes!" So the old man got up and walked out while the old lady was yelling, "I'm the one who should be walking out. Some one of these days I'm gonna go so far you'll never find me." They took the shoes to the shoemaker, who shrugged and just put another half sole over the one with the hole in it. The leather around the hole dried up real soon and became hard and curled and hurt his foot. She didn't look inside when he wanted to show it to her. She said that if he would shine them every day, they'd feel better. "That keeps the leather soft," she said. But when Elmer tipped the polish bottle, nothing came out. It was too late in the year for anybody to go barefoot, and anyway, he was never allowed to go barefoot in the city. That summer, they hadn't gone to the country. As he was always on the go, except when in school, his foot hurt a lot of the time, and he stopped often, and when he stopped, he would look around. There was always a lot to see, except where there were gas stations and new buildings, and these he avoided as they were hateful and dull. Right now, he was in the last block on Valleydale Avenue near Main Street, and there were no gas stations and no new buildings. He turned off the blue-gray flagstone sidewalk and went tentatively into the live poultry market. The live poultry market stank of something awful, but was interesting just the same. There were always cages of squawking chickens, sometimes ducks, sometimes rabbits who didn't squawk. Turkeys always before Thanksgiving, sometimes before Christmas, geese. Otherwise, that was an extra special day when there was a goose. Once upon a time, he used to come in with Oma, and she would feel the chickens to pick out a nice one. And then Chris, the market man, used to give them a penny for candy. And when he came back, the chicken already had its head chopped off and was scalded and being plucked. Nobody ever said he couldn't stay to watch it getting its head chopped off, and he often thought of waiting, but the temptation to spend the money was too strong. And sometimes the market man would give him a penny anyway, even when he was by himself. Over in the kosher side of the live poultry market, the old rabbi looked at him incuriously as he walked by, and returned to smoking his long pipe and reading his newspaper with the funny letters that looked like music. And Chris, the market man, was talking to some lady. Oma always used to say, in her slow, choppy way, as though each word was being hacked out with a hatchet from a block of wood, and her face looked the same way too, that Chris was all right. Chris was very good. He always saw that she got a good chicken and a good price. Used to say. Now, she said, Chris was trying to get rich too fast. She said he was keeping a woman, too. Elmer ambled around looking at the chopping block and the blood and sawdust and gave Chris some glances from the corners of his eyes. But Chris didn't offer any penny, didn't smile, didn't nod and raise his eyebrows in silent greetings. So Elmer, who had wised up and no longer looked in the back to see if a woman was being kept there, he now looked at the woman Chris was talking to. She had on a white coat, a long white coat with fur trimmings, and she had one of those things around her neck made out of a fox, and the fox's face was still on it, and glass eyes, you know? "I ain't got nothing for you today, Elma," Chris said. "I don't need nothing." He kept on giving the lady glances, and then her mouth went funny at the corners, and she moved her head and neck, and she gave him suddenly a real dirty look. "Go home, Elma," Chris said. "Go on, go home." Elmer had learned that if people, that is, if some man, said, "Get out of here," you better go right away. But if they said to "Go home, kid," or "Go home, Elmer," then you could go slowly. Next to the live poultry market, there weren't any baby rabbits here today anyway, was a dull, old building in which unfashionable doctors and such had their offices. Doctors. Ladies were always talking about some other lady who had a bump, and the doctor opened it up, and there was a part of a needle inside that had broken off, and by becoming real quiet, invisible, and inaudible, he had by and by learned that what they really meant was a crocheting needle. But try as hard as he might, he could never learn how the crocheting needle had broken off, or how it had worked its way through her system, or why. But he knew it had something to do with babies, because of the expression when the women talked about it, and in the same building were dentists and corset makers, and one or two lawyers. Elmer had never bothered to go inside more than once. Next was the tobacco store with the wooden Indian out front. In the doorway was the kind of crazy old lady. Some said her real name was O'Shee, and some said, no, that used to be her old name, but then she'd married some Dutchman named Kleinhams or Kleinhaus or something, but he died. Be that as it may, the woman stared from her ruined face, as though at the ruins of the world outside almost all the time, swaying back and forth, and saying, all she said, in a droning kind of voice, "Oh, Jesus, oh, Jesus, oh, Jesus." And so she was usually called only Mrs. O'Jesus. In the window of the tobacco store was like a room by itself, and there were 3 men in there making handmade cigars with a funny board with the grooves in it. Well, there used to be. Now there was only 1 man rolling cigars. He was tall as you could see when he wasn't bent over, and he had a very large white mustache. He wasn't the owner. Elmer went inside. The owner of the store stayed mostly way in the back of the store, the big, dark, old store, playing cards with other men, all smoking cigars. Elmer had heard that thousands of dollars changed hands in some of these games. He thought he would like to see some of these $1,000 bills. The owner's daughter, whose name was Hattie, a short and stumpy woman with a shawl over her shoulders, she took care of most of the business. And sometimes Elmer had business there. Sometimes one of his grandfathers would send him for cigars or snuff or chewing tobacco. And it smelled great. It had a neat, rich, dark, deep, great smell. And it was interestingly dark in that big old store, and the pictures on the cigar boxes were the only bright spots of color almost. The store didn't sell candy at retail, but sometimes Hattie would give him a piece from a bag on a shelf or something beneath the counter with the brass scales, where she was usually reading a copy of True Stories magazine with photographs showing the stories were really true, as she was doing today. And he got almost to the back of the store before suddenly she looked up and said, "Yes?" He just waved his hand a little as he kept on walking, but she said in a louder voice, "Don't you go there! What do you want?" And as he couldn't pretend anymore that he came to really buy something, he shrugged a little bit and swung around and came back and stopped by the counter and looked at the magazine because sometimes Hattie wanted to talk about some story. "What do you think about the rotten way they treated this poor girl just because she wasn't French the way her husband's family was?" Or something like that, she might say, Hattie. But now he saw that it was an old magazine, one they had already talked about, and he wondered why she was reading it again. Hattie said, "You don't want anything, you better go home." Too bad, because sometimes they'd had real interesting conversations. Sometimes she would say, "How come you know so much? Say, you know a lot for a boy your age." And sometimes she used to add to his knowledge some little item or other, like how a woman, if she was going to have a baby, she shouldn't sleep with her arm over her neck, because a lady did that once and her baby was born dead, strangled by a cord. But not today. Sometimes, even if he didn't have anything to buy for Grandpa, or Oma, or Uncle Bob, he would still ask for an empty cigar box, and usually got one. Hattie would usually give him one, and it smelled beautifully of cedar wood and had such little beautiful pictures, men in old ship captain clothes and Spanish ladies and pictures of Hackamak Bay with boats on it and Indians, too. However, by the way that Hattie was now looking down at the True Stories magazine, he knew better than to ask. "Well, so long, Hattie," Elmer said. The trolley tracks ran down the middle of the street. Now, in this same block, there were 2 candy stores, and in one of them, Bodenheimer's, there were trays and trays of penny candies in the glass case just past the cigar lighter where a tiny blue gas flame always burned inside a brass hood. So sometimes Elmer would buy some chicken corn and candy bananas and some chocolate babies and some candy fried eggs in their tin dishes with a little spoon, a tiny tin spoon, to eat it with. Maybe jelly beans or gumdrops or licorice whips or cherry whips, and put them in the cigar box and wander off slowly, and whenever he stopped, he could take out a piece of candy and suck on it. Start to suck on it. He hated hard candy, the rotten kind in the Christmas stocking. He loved chewy candy. And often when the candy had gotten nice and soft, Elmer couldn't resist chewing on it, and that was the end of it, until the next piece. Coming out of Bodenheimer's was a man with a box in his hand, and Elmer recognized him because he had come to their door a couple of days ago and said, "I'm a war veteran selling shoelaces, 2 for a nickel." Elmer went and asked his mother, and she had made an impatient noise and shook her head. Then, after a minute, she very slowly got 2 cents out of the old jar, which still read ORC ACD on its side, and said, "Tell him he can keep this." And the war veteran looked at the 2 cents just as slowly, and then he said, "Sonny, that's begging, and before I'd do that, I'd blow my brains out." And he went away. So Elmer went back and told his mother, and she didn't say a word. And so he asked if he could keep the pennies, and she yelled, "No!" and dropped them back in the jar. Often, old Mr. Bodenheimer used to give him an extra hunk of candy and say, "This is for the baker's dozen, and give your Oma and Opa a grüß from me." He'd asked his mother once what the baker's dozen meant, and she said, "It's just an expression for a free piece of something." The door had a bell that rang when Elmer went in, and he saw old Mr. Bodenheimer standing and looking at him, and the old man touched one end of his mustache with his finger, and he didn't say anything. Elmer said, "Hello, Mr. Bodenheimer," and the old man didn't say anything, and Elmer said, "Grüß Gott," which always made old man Bodenheimer smile. But he didn't smile, and he didn't say anything. And Elmer looked here and there, and he strolled up and down the aisles, and the old man never took his eyes off him, and never said anything, and never offered him anything. And finally, after Elmer was looking at the toys and the games, and then he looked at the magazines, Argosy, Blue Book, American, Liberty, Collier's, Saturday Evening Post, Ranch Romances, Dime Detectives, True Story, True Detective Mysteries, Weird Tales, Amazing Stories, Wonder Stories, Family Journal, American Boy, Boy's Life, The Open Road for Boys, his favorite. And every time he looked up, old Mr. Bodenheimer was still looking at him. Then suddenly he said, "I got to go now." Surprised, Elmer said, "Where?" Mr. Bodenheimer got suddenly very mad. "Where? What do you think? Where the Kaiser goes on foot. So go, now, go home. Go home, I say. Elmer, go home. Go home!" So Elmer strolled out, and the little bell rang again. And he looked back through the last window as he walked past the store, and he saw old Mr. Bodenheimer going through the back door of the store, the door with the white curtains on it, to the apartment where the Bodenheimers lived, and the old man was still looking at him. Bodenheimers had a real good smell, too, even though it was too late for Valentine's and too early for Halloween masks. Elmer looked up the street, but there was no trolley car in sight. Just delivery trucks and automobiles and one junk wagon and one milk wagon, and turning in from River Street, one big black touring car. A police car. He stopped and watched to see if anyone was going to be arrested, but the car just kept on going. A sign on the back of another car caught his eye. It said, "Wasn't the Depression awful?" Next was the pet shop, and this smelled almost as bad as the chicken market, although differently bad. Pete Miller, a fat man with one bad eye, ran it, and he didn't like no kids hanging around if they weren't going to buy nothing. Did he make that plain? But he didn't own the sidewalk. He couldn't stop you from looking in the window, where there was often a bunch of puppy dogs, more interesting than the inside, where there was lots of stuff, like dog collars and open bags of dog biscuits, which didn't taste like even a dog would want to eat them. "Them's Nellie's pups," he heard someone say. Nellie was a bitch who was part fox terrier and part something else, and every so often she would have these puppies, and Pete Miller would put them in the window and sell them. Elmer hoped he always sold them and didn't give them to the dog pound. The dog pound was way out by the pest house, the city of Yonkers, contagious diseases hospital, out in West Yonkers, and the most that Elmer had ever gotten up nerve to do was ride past on the trolley car in a good transfer that he found and look. There was no chance of his having a dog. When he was younger, they said, "when you're older." Just the other day, he had asked his mother, and she pressed her mouth tight and shook her head. "Well, why not? Please?" And she said, "No, I said no, I said no, I said no, 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 no." Earlier, she had been visiting his grandmother and Aunt Mary on the other side of the family. This always made her mad. And as her voice got higher and her face got redder, she grabbed the dish towel and clouted him with it, and she shoved the kitchen chair out of his way and ran off. Right next to the Pete Miller's pet shop was the other candy store, and this one didn't have the nice, neat smell of the first one, and neither did it have the real, rich old tobacco smell either, because it smelled of stale smoke. Stale, cheap, old smoke. And it didn't really have much candy anyway. Nor did it sell magazines, just scratch sheets and the Daily Mirror. This candy store didn't go very far back at all, but the back, boy, did that go far back. And there were always a bunch of men in the back saying things like, "Oh, you liking the third?" And that meant in the third race at some racetrack. So everybody knew that Jack's place was really a bookie joint. However, it did have a slot machine that gave out a roll of absolutely the world's worst candy after it showed you pictures of different kinds of fruit. Sometimes somebody didn't pull the lever all the way down, and if you were the next person and lucky, sometimes you got not only the candy for free, but some money too. Very cautiously, Elmer went into Jack's. Very suddenly, Jack was right next to him saying, "Get out of here, you!" It wasn't a very interesting place anyway. On the other side of this, the last block of Valleydale Avenue, on the corner of Main Street, was Berman's Drug Store, and the rest of the block between River and Main was one entire stone wall, with one closed iron gate in it. There had been a sloping hill there once, and it had been cut away to make the street, or anyway, maybe to straighten the street. And when they were digging that hill away, guess what happened? Guess what they found? Jack Archer's grandfather told Jack that his father had told him they had found human bones there when they were digging. "Cross my heart and hope to die, Elmer. Honest to God." And the rest of that block, the Broadway and River Street sides, taking up most of the whole block, was the old Dutch Reformed church, plus the Sunday school and church offices buildings and 2 old houses where some old ladies lived and a garden. This, what was left of a bluff, had once overlooked the Gristmill River, or Hackamak Creek as it was also called, where it widened and used to be pouring down in the old days in a sort of falls before it flowed into Hackamak Bay, which was sort of a part of the Hudson River and sort of a part of New York Bay. But most of that river, or creek, there had been covered over in streets and houses and warehouses, lumber yards and coal sheds and stores built over it. If nothing else happened, Elmer would maybe turn into Main Street and go down to the bay. That was always interesting. Berman's Drug Store smelled nice, too. Besides the medicines, besides the soda fountain, delicious sarsaparilla. There were all kinds of glossy things for sale in glass cases, but mostly for women. Elmer was not interested. He was interested in the boxes of fancy chocolates, also glossy, but he had never even thought of buying any of them. Once he and Jack Archer had gone in for some empty gelatin capsules, and Mr. Berman had seemed surprised. "Capsules? What do you want them for?" "To make jumping beans, Mr. Berman. You know, you put BB shot in them, and you put them on something that it slants just a little bit, and they, jump." Mr. Berman had laughed, had sold them some empty capsules for a nickel. "That's all right, I guess. It's supposed to be against the law without a prescription, but I guess the law isn't going to worry about a couple of jumping beans for a couple of boys." Druggists had to worry about the law a lot, it seemed. For instance, the angry old woman squawking up at the counter. "I'm sorry, Mrs. White," old Berman was saying, shaking his head. "I have known you for years. I know you and your family, and I'll be glad to fill a prescription for you. But without a prescription, I can't do it. It's against the law. It's against the law." The old lady yelling, "What law? What law?" Berman, "It isn't the money. I trust you for the money. It's the Harrison Law, the Harrison Narcotics Act. You know that—" Eventually she did know that even if she had forgotten it or hoped old Berman had forgotten it. She made a noise of disgust and annoyance. "Ah! Harrison narcotics! Harrison narcotics!" she repeated. The white-haired druggist shrugged, sighed. "I can't argue with Uncle Sam," he said. "Believe me, if Uncle Sam had raised 10 children, there would have been none of this nonsense about Harrison's narcotics. How does Uncle Sam expect to raise 10 children if she can't even put paregoric in her milk to keep 'em from crying?" But the druggist only sighed again and stretched out his hand in a gesture of helplessness. And Elmer, who was trying both to listen and to look at the names on the boxes of fancy candy, Schrafts, Louis Sherry, must have made a noise then, because then old Mr. Berman looked up and saw him, and he said, not looking angry but shaking his head very, very firmly, he said, "Go home, Elmer. Go home now. Go home." By and by it would be getting late. If Elmer had got too interested and was late, he would really get it. On the other hand, if he got back early, he knew he wouldn't be able to keep from asking, "What's for supper?" And then, likely as not, his mother would yell at him. "How do I know what's for supper? What are you asking me for what's for supper? Why don't you ask your rotten father what's for supper? Or your grandmother and aunt?" That was the grandmother and aunt from the other side of the family. "What are you eating my hat out for?" she would probably yell. As Elmer stopped and looked back into the windows of Berman's at the 2 giant jars of red and green, what were they? He heard the sound of the trolley car. He timed what happened next just right. No sooner had the trolley car come to a stop, it never went any farther than the bottom of Valleydale until it was so late at night that it was early in the morning, really, and the last trolley's time to turn Main Street and go down into the car barn across the street catty-corner from the depot. Elmer was there behind it. And while the passengers were still getting off, he had deftly pulled down the trolley pole at the back end from the overhead wire and let its rope snuggle back into the place where it snuggled, and then he ran around to the front end and pulled the rope there until the pole rose, and then with one quick spark, and no more, rested against the wire. The trolley car was now almost ready to start back the other way. As soon as the very last passenger had gotten off, Elmer darted up the steps and into the car. "Hello, Mr. Duffy," he said. Mr. Duffy was lighting a cigarette and waved one hand. Elmer sped back the whole length of the car, grabbing with each hand the brass handles and the woven cane seat backs, and push-pulling them clatter-clatter as he passed, until he had done the whole car, and all the seats were facing the other way. "Thanks, Elma," Mr. Duffy said. He folded his own little round seat down and made his way back to the other end of the car, now suddenly and again the front end, and put the tiller into its socket. He waved his hand again as he opened the door. "Off you go," he said. "Aw, can't I stay on?" Elmer pleaded. "Please, Mr. Duffy. I'll get off before you start. Huh, Mr. Duffy?" Nope. A spot on my dispatches. Off you go. I gotta get a cup of coffee. Come on." And once more he waved his hand. "Okay, Mr. Duffy." An old man in a dirty overcoat was waiting to get on, and an old woman hesitated on the curb, but Mr. Duffy waved the old man back down. Not yet. I got a couple minutes yet."
"Oh, let me get on and sit down," the old man said. "I'm tired of waiting."
Mr. Duffy shook his head. Nope. The spot on my dispatches. I could lose my job." The old man looked around in vague and senile annoyance.
"Where's the conductor? I got my fare."
Conductor? Ah, give us a rest. Where you been? The company fired all the conductors. Economy. And they'll fire me if I let yous." He didn't finish the subject. The old man sort of slunk back onto the sidewalk. The trolley car door closed as the steps folded back up all at once. Mr. Duffy half turned to go into Maloney's around the corner, a curtain running the whole length of the windows as it had ever since the day when Maloney's, after 30 years as a saloon, had opened one morning as a speakeasy. Suddenly, the motorman looked to right and left, thrust his hand into some secret place near the car door, the steps descended, and the door opened. Again, the old man and old woman moved to get aboard. Again, Mr. Duffy gestured down with rising color in his face. He darted up, closed the door behind him, and swearing, half stumbling, half crouching, trotted up the length of the car, peering under the seats. "Out of there," he ordered, lurching to halt. "Get out of there! Get off for the trolley car! A fine way you reward my kindness! Go home!" he ordered, chasing the boy ahead of him. "Go home, Elmer! Go home! Go home!" The motorman slapped his money on the bar. "I'm in a hurry, Maloney," he said. "That damned kid." Maloney stared at him in rigid and affronted astonishment as only Maloney could do. "In a hurry for what?" he demanded. Duffy stared back. "For a glass of beer," he said. "What else?" "What else? Why, maybe Moxie, Orange Crush, Sarsaparilla. Beer? There isn't any beer." Duffy stared at him aghast. His hand twitched. It had been a long, long day. "What in the hell do you mean, there isn't no beer?" Maloney shrugged. "Why, what would any man mean by saying there is no beer? There is not any beer, Joseph Duffy. Maybe later, not yet. Is there maybe something else that you'd like?" Mr. Joseph Duffy's lips moved a moment. Then the spark seemed to go out of him. "A cup of coffee," he said. "But hurry it up, would you? If the spotters spots me absent, I'll lose the job." Maloney's face lost its frozen dignity. His thick eyebrows did a rapid flutter. No, then I'll put it in a cotton for you. Lots of sugar, milk. Mind you don't spill it. Pay me another time." The day was indeed declining, even though Mount Hackamak, a sorry substitute for a green mountain, covered its retreat behind a crown of factory chimneys. Often the sunset was spectacular, bloody red from the smoke and industrial dust. Today, it was thin and clear. Up and down Main Street, merchants awaited sons, daughters, sisters-in-law, someone to mind the store so they could be home for supper. For some, to be sure, some few who had never managed to move away from behind the store, supper was merely a retreat into a tiny apartment at the rear. For others, supper was on its way to them, coming in a dish or bowl with another dish or bowl turned upside down over it and wrapped in a towel to conserve the heat. "Hold it like this," were the directions. Afterwards, the towels would be checked to make sure nothing had spilled. Sundry little dramas were being played out. "Here it is, Pa. You can eat now." "I don't want anything. I'm not hungry. You eat it." "Pa, I already ate." "You sure? Look at me. I don't believe you." "Honest, Pa." A pause. Then, "Come on. We'll split it." "All right, Pa." Grandpa, Dad, Zeta, Nonna. And in between these little scenes, strophe, antistrophe, like the responses in a litany. "Go home, Elmer. Go home. Get out of here. Beat it, kid. Go home, Elmer. Go home."
So what'd you think?
I loved listening to it, especially I like to hear a male voice rather than my own voice.
I mean,
It kind of brought it to life.
did it when you read it and now you've had a chance to listen to it? I mean, did it bring back some memories? Did you recognize some things? Was it?
Oh, yes. I probably should read it again and see what else I recognize. I think my son found some things that I didn't, but just little things like at one point he mentions a tobacco store with an Indian out front, and yeah, that was on Palisade Avenue in Yonkers. It was a landmark. And well, of course, the whole premise about the beer running through the pipes in what the area is called Getty Square, but the old timers called it the Village, and he calls it the Village. And it was in what has always been Chicken Island, and he makes it Turkey Island, which I thought was really funny. And he mentions the trolleys, which were the means of transportation back in the 30s and 40s. And of course, the sugar house, that's still there, still operating. And then he had a Judge Boodle, which had to be Judge Boot, who was a city judge for many, many years, and whose sister was a teacher of mine in junior high.
Oh my
So
God.
I'm sure there were loads of other things that maybe slipped past me, but it was definitely about Yonkers.
What about the like the poultry market? I think.
Oh yes. My father-in-law would go every morning and kill as many chickens as were needed for that day. And so yeah, it's quite possible that Avram saw him there.
You know, one of the things that has been really fascinating, this is all new to me, when I helped edit and publish this book, there was a lot of pushback and requests to change some of the accents and the dialogue, and I couldn't help thinking about a quote that Ursula Le Guin had said, which was, Avram had an ear for language and accents, and I pushed back and said, no, we're not changing those. A lot of the DTHIS and some of the other things. And maybe if Avram had been alive, maybe he would have allowed for those changes. I'm not sure, but I was just, there were a lot. I would say, 1 out of every 8 was really, of the people that read it, there were 2 people who were really fanatical. I don't want to say fanatical, but were upset that I didn't change it. And I would say that I'm glad I didn't. But I'm curious about your thoughts on those accents, on just if that was what it was like, if he captured it properly.
Yeah, well, I didn't talk like that, but there certainly were a lot of people who did. Yep. Yonkers at that time had a lot of Irish and Italian immigrants and from all over Eastern Europe. But I figure that was not easy to write like that. And he went to a lot of trouble to do that dialect. So it would have kind of erased a part of Avram to erase that. I think you did well to keep it.
Thanks. Yeah, that was most of the feedback I got, but I was just curious, as someone, maybe you recognize some of those accents.
Yeah, there were people who talked like that. Sure.
How well known is the story, I guess, how well known was the story of Dutch Schultz in Yonkers? And how well known is the story of Dutch Schultz in Yonkers?
Well, of course, at the time that it happened, which was in the 30s, that it was certainly well known. I grew up knowing that, if you went to Chicken Island, you were walking over the pipes where the beer had run. Probably now, not everybody knows about it. It's every now and then somebody brings it up again for some reason. It's I would say if you ask the average person on the street in Yonkers today, they wouldn't know what you were talking about. But over the years, it has gotten intermittently a lot of publicity.
And anything else in terms of beer? Anything else that jumps out at you, or you insight or anything you'd want to share that just jumped out at you from the story?
Well, the understanding he had of the different types of people from a child to the older people to the mayor and all the underlings. I think he really had a grasp of so many different types of people. It's kind of impressive.
Wow. I guess, last question for me, any final memories, if you were sharing to the world what the world should know about Avram, any final memories that you'd want to share or thoughts?
We knew him for so many years, went through so many things with him, and probably the last time we actually saw him was when we made a West Coast trip in 1964, I guess, and we did see him in San Francisco. We always felt privileged to know somebody who was so talented and who had such a great sense of humor and was able to reach out to so many people. He with his science fiction and his fantasy, and then for a while he was writing true story, in quotes, true stories that weren't necessarily true. And we just were privileged to know him.
He wrote so many different things. He wrote science fiction, fantasy, true stories, and stories that didn't necessarily fit in a genre. I think he tried to leave science fiction several times, tried to get away from it. What do you think he really loved? Or maybe he didn't even know. Like it depended on where his mood was at the time.
I think you're right. I mean, at some point, for a good part of his life, I think he was writing what would ever make a living. I mean, if I can sell it, I'm writing it. That influenced a lot. But of course, you have to have the ability, and he did.
Yeah.
To come up with these things, and he very much enjoyed interacting with other science fiction writers. He got a lot of fun out of that.
If you had to kind of just, in terms of what was most meaningful to him, and maybe you don't know, but was there maybe a sense of what writing was most meaningful to him? Do you any sense of that? Or
that would be hard to say at this point. It was probably, I would say, whatever he was writing at that particular moment was his favorite until he went on to the next thing.
I love it. Well, I can't thank you enough. Please stay in touch. And
I will. This brought back so many wonderful memories.
Well, thank you again.
You're most welcome, and keep up the good work.
Thanks.
It sounds like a story to me, some crazy fable that you would not believe.